This is TrueNorthTV, powered by Communitech. From Waterloo Region, Ontario, Canada, to the world. The conversations you need and want to hear from interesting people on topics at the intersection of technology and humanity. Tech for good. Let's get started.
Thanks, Talia. And hello, world, and welcome to another episode of True North TV. I'm Ian Klugman, and I'm your host. In this episode, we're going to talk with a very special guest about venture capital, the type of investment that, over the past half-century, has become a primary source of growth capital for many of the world's most successful startups and technology companies. And we're going to frame this discussion around a somewhat provocative question: has venture capital lost its way? My guest today is Steve Blank, a leading Silicon Valley thinker whom many consider to be the father of modern entrepreneurship. Steve, who is himself an entrepreneur as well as an author and an academic, is credited with launching the lean startup movement, a key driver of the startup boom we've seen over the past decade. So Steve, thank you so much for joining us on True North TV today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
You know, it's interesting because this is going to be the second last episode of True North TV this year. The first episode was with John Seely Brown. And we talked a lot about, what had happened as far as technology. He, of course, was the chief scientist at Park, where they invented the things like the mouse and GUI and all that good stuff. But we talked a bit about the fact that, in the sort of the 70s, in the late 60s and into the 70s, there was a real, technology was romanticized. And it was going to lead to the era or the age of leisure time. And of course, now we sort of look back at that, bygone era and kind of scratch our heads a bit because, of course, now we're dealing with FANG. Whatever FANG, well, we know what FANG stands for. But what has been the journey from your perspective, Steve?
It's been one heck of a journey. Where I had to explain what a personal computer was to my relatives, to now billions of us carry them in our pockets. So, my path was as an entrepreneur, but in parallel, it's been kind of interesting to watch the people who fund it, evolve as well. We still use the same words, entrepreneurs and startups and venture capitalists, but they actually mean something very different than what they originally were.
So why don't we start there? I think that's a great place to start is, how did the VC industry get started? What did it do for technological innovation? And, what was the model then?
Yeah, so it's interesting to remember, and I'll start with Silicon Valley. And just remember, when I talk about Silicon Valley, it was a unlikely accident rather than a government-designed place. But in the 1950s and 60s, Silicon Valley actually made devices for the U.S. military. Its expertise came out of a single professor at Stanford, Fred Terman, who in World War II had set up a electronics and microwaves weapons lab at Harvard, and pulled out of Stanford, and then came back to Stanford and decided to focus Stanford's engineering prowess on microwaves and electronics and building devices that were ultimately used in military aircraft and missiles and whatever. Not that Stanford was selling it to the government, but they were encouraging something which had never been encouraged in universities before, and that was to encourage professors to sit on boards of startups or become advisors, and their grad students to actually leave to start companies rather than pursue advanced degrees. But back then, there was no venture capital, so they immediately had to go out and get government contracts. And then in the late 50s, another technology showed up in Silicon Valley. It was the silicon. The first semiconductor company was done by a guy named William Shockley, who had come out of Bell Labs, but before that had a military background. And again, they had to raise money essentially themselves. There was no professional venture community, but out of Shockley came Fairchild Semiconductor and Intel, and in 20 years, 65 more chip companies. Now, about the mid-60s or so, some private investors, kind of, financial types, but they didn't have a venture fund. They would just kind of did this as a club, would drive down from San Francisco, where the money was at the time, and meet these crazy little startups and started writing small checks, which we would now call, angel capital. At the same time, the U.S. government, starting with Sputnik, which was for the United States a transformative event in 1958, when the Soviet Union put a satellite in space before us, we started worrying we were behind them. And so we started a government program called the SBIR and SBAA programs. And so the government would kind of become partners with any investors in these startups. And for the first, 10 years or so, that was the primary way that early investors got money from other than customers. But in the mid 1970s, the U.S. government changed two rules, not to encourage startups, but basically changed the game. They number one said to what are called pension funds, that is investment accounts that companies and unions had, that said, well, now you could put up to 10% of your investment into risky ventures. It was called the prudent man rule. That is, be careful with the money you have. And a risky investment was then thought of as venture capital companies or funds. And so all of a sudden it changed the amount of money from millions to potentially billions of dollars available. And the next year they had 1978 and 79, they changed the tax code, which said, no, you don't no longer need to pay almost 50% tax. It's now 30 some odd percent tax. And both those things kind of drove an incredible amount of money. The entire venture capital money raised in the early 70s was maybe $10 million. I mean, now my students get that as a seed round. I mean, it's kind of amazing. So this is a long, shaggy dog story to say what we think of as venture capital being around, since the pyramids, is a pretty modern invention, and certainly modern at scale, and went through various cycles. The boom and bust, and the dot-com bust was fairly famous, where, after the bust happened, VCs were hiding under their desks and couldn't find anybody writing checks, and a lot of firms went out of business. But and then in 2008 in the United States, when we had a housing crash, that cycle happened again. But now we're in one of the largest boom cycles of venture capitalists making more money at scale with more zeros than ever imagined. And none of them, no one imagined this would happen in the middle of a pandemic. But 2020 turned out to be probably by far the most profitable year if you were a venture capitalist. That's a long story, very short question you just asked.
Now, listen, so what happened along the way that made investors go off track and become, as you described to the New Yorker, a money-hungry mob that is no longer interested in the public good? How and why did this happen?
Well, let's be clear. Even in the beginning, none of them were running charitable foundations, at least, when they were called venture funds. They might have had charitable foundations, but they weren't their funds. But, almost all of them, and maybe I just met a weird subset, but almost all of them had the interest of their country and public good in mind. While venture capital was a financial and still is a financial asset class, VCs back then, thought of themselves as kind of a different breed. They were almost gatekeepers because they were of what got funded and not. And funded things. I mean, they didn't fund real estate. They didn't fund games. They didn't fund. In fact, some of that was written into their kind of, their charter. But of course, that changed over time. People realized, well, if you do some other things, then you could now make a lot more money, and maybe the game, should be a little different. In the United States, you have to remember, we used to have regulatory agencies. Securities and Exchange Commissions and whatever, even though venture capital is like hedge funds, essentially completely unregulated. And so, but there was at least people kind of looking if you were taking companies public. But I don't know if you see it in Canada, but in the US, we kind of gave up regulation a while ago. And I think what you're seeing is kind of back to Gilded Age capitalism on multiple sectors, not only just venture capital. And so two things happened in the 21st century, none of them done with malice, maybe three things, but all of them contributed to this. Number one is, if you would have told the VCs of the 20th century, look, if we just the law, we could make billions of dollars, you would have not only been thrown out of their office, you probably would never have gotten funded. Well, excuse me, but that's the premise of Airbnb, of Uber, of Tesla in the United States, that if they go after markets that have rent seekers in them, that do have laws and regulations, but they could bust through those, that they could not only change people's behavior, but they could create entire industries. Does that make sense? Is number one?
It makes perfect sense.
Right. The second thing that happened, and again, it started out with all good intentions, and I was a cheerleader for this as well. Andreessen, who invented the first, widely used browser called Netscape, became a venture capitalist. And when he started his firm, Andreessen Horowitz, they were looking for a way to differentiate themselves from everybody else 15 years ago in 2005. And Mark, having been an entrepreneur and then a founder of another great company, kind of real called Opsware, I think, realized that all these other venture capitalists were optimizing for the founder to be replaced by a senior suit, someone who had an MBA, who looked good in front of investors, etc. But that the cycle time of invention was so fast that if you got rid of the founder too early, by the time there was a liquidity event, that is, you could make money, you were lost. And so you needed to keep the founder in place. That's morphed into things like founders now have dual class stock. Founders control the board. Founders basically, if you're in a hot unicorn and you're in an argument with the founder and you're an investor, the idea is you won't get to put more money into the company. And that's like shooting yourself in the head, because most of these unicorns are just, going to make an obscene amount of money. Why would you want to argue with the founder? So what used to be the role of a fiduciary, that is somebody responsible for managing the company and hiring and firing the CEO, is now basically an investor hanging on for dear life, trying to pump more money into something that will turn out 10 or 100x of what they put in. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense.
And so, the pendulum has swung, I believe, way in the other direction. Because if you just add up all the valuations of all the e-commerce companies and social companies and, all the other things, and then say, well, just as a thought experiment, what if we put that money to some other uses? Would the world have been a better place, and would our lives have been better? And my favorite example is, of course, when social media started, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or pick your favorite, everybody believed, including me, that this will bring us all together. Very rapidly, we discovered that it did exactly the opposite. Yet, those companies are now so powerful that, there's no way you're going to regulate them, even though, at least in a democracy, even though people in authoritarian countries have discovered that's the first thing you need to regulate, because, in fact, they create social discord, not social cohesion. But here's the kicker. When your board has no fiduciary responsibility, one, and two is optimized without any regulatory controls, with the only goal to maximize money rather than social good, you end up, just paying off a bunch of, people whose job it is to spin what a great things these companies are, rather than the harm they do. And I don't mean to pick on them, but, that's a great example of where in the 20th century, boards would have been aghast that their companies were doing harm. That wasn't the culture, and nor was that the behavior. You would have been fired as a CEO in about 15 minutes. And I'm not suggesting let's bring back the good old days. I'm just suggesting that other than can we make the biggest pile of money, there is no social contract anymore between investors and their community, their country, or anything else. That's it. It's like, can we make the biggest pile of money? like, I'm surprised they're not all opening meth labs. That's how you should think of social media. It's like a giant meth lab. It's great. It feels good. You're addicted, and somebody's making a lot of money off of you.
It's interesting you should say that, because, of course, we for the last number of years we've run True North Festival that started out at 2,500 people and was meant to be 25,000 people this year, but of course that pandemic thing got in the way. Our focus has been around the notion of tech for good, and so the idea that, not just can you build it, but should you build it, and having people at least consider the responsibility they have for how their baby is used. Do you think there's a shift happening? I mean, we've all been exposed to that pap called Tristan, who has repented now. Is there a shift away from trying to make things as addictive as possible? Is there a shift away?
No, of course not. Why would anybody want to do that? Be like, oh, why don't I sell you less addictive cigarettes? Like, what? No, my whole job is, to like addict you so I could sell more. Or why don't I put less caffeine in my soda? Well, then I might as well be drinking water. Oh, well, you can't make a business out of packaged water. But besides that, I mean, no, I think it's going to require government regulation, because I think we've just run the science experiment. Well, what happens? There's a free market, to Gilded Age capitalism.
With the VCs directing their funds towards often dubious investments, what does it mean for the founders who are sincerely trying to build viable businesses and solve meaningful problems?
Yeah. So let me go back for a second, and then I'm going to answer the question you just asked. By the way, what we've been talking about is essentially, social media apps, maybe hardware, etc. There's a whole nother parallel universe, which are life science companies who make therapeutics and devices and diagnostics and digital health.
Yep.
And just by definition, they're at least, if their drugs or devices work, then people's health, improve. Now, on the other hand, that's also been a gold rush and boom. The good news is we can now design vaccines in 9 months rather than 9 years. The bad news is there's a huge pressure to take things public that are unproven and untested, and a huge pressure on regulatory agencies to approve those things, because, like, if they don't get approved, then like those billions invested go down the tube. So same type of pressures, but at least one could argue that, if your grandmother's still alive because some startup got funded, that's a lot different than you could now post 140 characters. So let me go back to your previous question, which was,
what about those founders who are trying to build companies, meaningful companies, to solve real world problems?
Yeah. So remember, when you take money from someone as a founder, their business model has now become yours. It's a big idea. You might have, I want to like bring people together and I want to do X or Y, and that's great. But you know what? And your founders and your investors might really like you, and they might kind of share that utopian vision. But like when it comes down to like, so how are we doing next quarter? I have yet to see somebody say, let's not optimize that number. I'm sure Mark Zuckerberg didn't, start sitting at Harvard thinking, well, I think I'm going to destroy democracy. Nor did his investors say that. Let's go destroy democracy. And in fact, when there was Arab Spring, we were using social media to kind of spread democracy. But all of a sudden, when you found out that you could addict people and then monetize that addiction, it became a very different company. And sometimes the founders go along with it, and sometimes, not. But eventually, we tend to optimize, without regulation, we tend to optimize dollars and cents. These are drugs, but they're not prescribed, and nor are they regulated as drugs. Founder friendly typically means founder control. But there's another thought experiment to have had. And this goes not for just startups, but for large corporations. Imagine we said to investors and to CEOs, you can't make more than $1 billion a year. Let's just pick some huge number. you think we would lose any founders? Any? Maybe we'd lose them 10 years down the line, but you think we'd lose any? I don't think so. Okay. So now we say you can't make more than $100 million a year. Think we'd lose any founders or at least VC investors? I don't think so. And we could figure out what that number is, but right now you should understand there is no number, right? And if society's goal is who dies with the biggest and largest toys, then we shouldn't have any. But if the society's goal is to have a just and equitable society while not strangling innovation in its crib, I want to emphasize the last part, then we could think about, how do we make this a little more equitable?
Do you have thoughts around how to solve that riddle?
Well, I just think having a bunch of thought exercises, just like the one I threw out on multiple parts of what would be one process to put in place, and let me be clear, regulation put in place by people who've never run a lemonade stand is not a good idea, and typically that's where that comes from. So I want to be careful, but I think people who have built businesses and people who have now had a couple of years to think about the consequences of these businesses could probably design a system that still kept maximum innovation. In fact, could maybe even turn the incentives upside down in the tax codes of multiple countries that says, wait a minute, all those incentives are now to get bigger. Why don't we have those incentives to start stuff? Like, and the bigger you get, the less those incentives should be because they're already big. And let me tell you, the word socialism is not in my vocabulary. And having been a regulator, I'm not like everything should be regulated. Yeah. I'm just saying that in this conversation, we've run the science experiment. We have 40 years or 50 years to look back of so how we doing? And people rarely do that. They live in the moment and go, oh, this is great and whatever. No. How we doing on that social media stuff? How's that affected your lives, your family's life, your community's life, your country's life? Really? Not that great, huh? What are we doing about it? Nothing much, Like, how are we doing with some of this other stuff? Well, not that great, but like everybody's making money. Well, that everybody is a very rarefied, view. Actually, as a capitalist and a born and died capitalist, I've read enough history to know sometimes it doesn't end well when those disparities get so large that people who don't really care take over and throw out the baby with the bathwater. That's the thing that I think we all should lose a little sleep over.
It's kind of interesting. I had a conversation with Josh Lerner in April, talking about VC and his thoughts on what was happening in the world. One of the things that he mentioned that he was encouraged about was the fact that different kinds of partners were coming together. Big Pharma was coming together to work collaboratively on, vaccines and testing technology. And when I looked at this whole kind of virus thing, I thought, maybe this is something that's going to bring us together. How do we mend America, let alone the world?
There should be a 12-step recovery program. and the first step usually is identify the problem. I don't think we've remember how much money then each part of social media companies spend on PR and lobbying. So first of all, you got to get above those noise of those paid hacks who, and that's their job. But to say, well, we've run this experiment. Where are we? I keep going back to, we have the data. We have the data that says, no, just having, a couple of filters really doesn't help. Your business model is destructive. Well, if I'm one of those companies, screw you guys. I'll show up at a couple more congressional hearings, but we're still printing money. And I think this is a question no longer about company regulation, but about democracy itself. It's interesting to note that it was actually China who a decade ago built the Great Firewall to keep out outside ideas and then regulate internal discussion. And I'm not ever suggesting we do the same, but I'm suggesting they saw this coming It's a big idea. They saw this coming a decade before we did, and put things in place that not only shut down the discussion, they shut down everything. Um, that's not anything close to what I'm suggesting, but it is interesting to note they saw this coming. The other thing we should see that's coming is that nightmare of a dystopian society when you have social capital being measured online. And if you want to see what that looks like, look at China and look what they've done to the Uyghurs and they're about to do to Hong Kong and doing to Tibet. That's a model for using social media to do even worse than what we've been doing. But you could imagine some US company going, hey, what a great business model. We'll give you social capital and credit for doing behavior X, Y, and Z. I don't think that's where we want to go. But unless we pick some direction and realize that where we are isn't good and that there are people making a lot of money from it isn't good, that we have a drug problem. And we've not declared it a drug yet.
Do they need to see the torches and pitchforks coming before they course correct and start solving real problems again?
No, they'll never do that. People never solve. I mean, the last people to solve problems are the ones who are profiting off of them, right? I think history has shown us that the last thing you do is abandon being a drug dealer, right? This is the nature of the capitalist system we've put in place. And again, you're hearing this from like a major capitalist. But I think, at least in the U.S., we went from unfettered capitalism in the 1880s through 1890s, what we call the Gilded Age in the United States. I think Canada went through somewhat of a similar period until in the 1930s to maybe the early 1970s, we basically had a more equitable society. We basically worked hard in moving the bottom and the top a little closer together because we thought that was actually good for everyone. It was good for the nation. It kept people from coming with pitchforks, etc. And then about 20 or 30 years ago, at least in the United States, we decided that now it's a free-for-all, everybody for themselves. And we started by calling it the trickle-down theory, and we used all kinds of fancy words. Well, we basically said, you're on your own.
Right to work legislation, right to work legislation, which basically means there's no minimum wage, but it sounds good.
So a lot of it sounds good because, in fact, the things that people have figured out how to do, when you start demonizing unions, which all is flaws, etc., okay, then no one wants to join a union. But in the United States, and I think in Canada as well, the big bipartisan push was, let's offshore manufacturing. Right? It's like, we can get cheaper products, and you could go to whatever superstores in your neighborhood and get things that, and say consumers are happy. What you don't notice is every mom and pop store around you went out of business. And more importantly, every national industry you had, not only did that go out of business, but all the ancillary services and products and whatever also left, whether it was the automotive business or in the US, the semiconductor business, all that went offshore, but all those other workers, such that you can't now even, build that thing anymore because none of those skills exist in your country. Those were done by people optimizing the bottom line. And the only people who were trying to raise the flag in this case in the US were the unions going, excuse me, this is a bad idea. And once you demonize anything those people said, I don't trust them. It's the union. They're just trying to save, union payrolls. Well, it turns out, in hindsight, you look back to some of the things they said, and it was exactly true. And I'm not making a case for we ought to go back to the way it was. We ought to, as I said, step back and go, so what did we learn when everybody said, what we essentially did was fund China's rise of the middle class, which eventually funded China's development of a military that now will challenge the West. And we essentially funded their Belt and Road program so they could now go industrialize the rest of the world. Came from all of us now buying goods and services that we should have been buying from ourselves. So we kind of got that little plan wrong about what the post-industrial country would look like.
We did the same thing in Canada as well, is that, in our quest for a $300 TV, we truly gave away our capacity to make things. And of course now, we've been scrambling, both as a community and as a country, to figure out how to make things again and to find people who know how to make things.
It wasn't that the Chinese came and did it, is that everybody who had a financial interest became the enabler and the co-conspirator. And I don't mean like conspiracy, but a co-enabler of, it makes I make more money this way, or my company is more profitable. Well, yeah, it's more profitable because you just laid off 1,000 Canadians or Americans, and there are 1,000 Chinese working at a tenth the price. Well, see, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is like, and I'll go back to my favorite hobby horse here is when you don't have a national industrial policy, but all you have is a financial policy driven by bankers and hedge funds managers and activist investors. That's what you end up with. If you have a national industrial policy that says, well, what's important to our nation and what's important to the health and security of its people, you come up with different conclusions.
Why do you think we're incapable of establishing and developing national industrial policies at this point in time in history?
Well, I keep going back to, all the paid enablers, whether they're PR people or lobbyists or consultants, etc. The people, it's now the golden rule. He who has the gold makes the rules. So it's campaign donations. It's, in fact, the inability of the other side to make a cogent argument, and then once you demonize the people who make, I'll go back to, it was the only people who were making a cogent argument were the unions. But again, strategically brilliant, the other side demonized the unions, so any message coming from them was immediately suspect as self-serving. And of course, it was self-serving, but it shouldn't have been suspect because it was probably the best description of what was going to happen. So yeah, I think it's going to take a set of both politicians and people from respected ends to kind of say, let's explain to you why you're unemployed. Here's what happened. And before we go with what we should do going forward. And probably number one is stop trusting the people who got us here. And so we've gotten way far from your original question about VCs. But I think it's kind of important to see, how we got where we are and to start asking the questions, do we want to keep doing the same things? My particular solution is we actually do need to step back and there are lots of people who've been thinking about it, but just be able to communicate to each other and agree, here's what went wrong. Okay, great. We agree on that. Great. What is the policy that our country and community or city wants to follow going forward? And if that's called the national industrial policy, so be it. It turns out, at least in the United States, that's called the third rail, meaning you touch that, you die. And so for decades, politicians avoided, because that was communism, that was socialism, that was whatever. But you could kind of ask, well, how's the current system working out for employment and people's job satisfaction? And I would suggest that we just haven't coherently explained what an alternative is to, without it getting a label that people think of as a pejorative. So I've been babbling, Ian. What was your question?
Oh, you answered my question. Buried in there was an answer to the question. I got one more for you. One of the things that's happened coming out of this pandemic, of course, is that proximity has become optional, and we're hiring people. We now can hire people literally around the world as easily as we can hire them in Canada. And you don't need to be in, a garage in Palo Alto. And team formation probably is going to change significantly, because it is not about getting a bunch of people together in the same room and ordering pizza. What do you think that the big changes are going to be coming out from this pandemic? How is it going to affect, work and firm formation and the way that people work.
So we're starting that question now. That's a 2-hour answer. that's a series, Ian. So I'll just say yes, it will. but I think I'm going to tell you I don't know. Period, because I was wrong about what would happen in the pandemic. I thought we'd be in an economic malaise. The stock market would crash forever.
I read that. I read that piece that you wrote at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah, turned out all those predictions were simply wrong. And so, there's a couple models. Will everybody, the minute you get a vaccine, go back to 100% normal and move back to cities and whatever? But that is, or even more so, like now double down on things they missed. I mean, restaurants might be 10x as packed because I haven't eaten a good meal and I'm eating out for the next 3 months in a row. Or will people at the other extreme is like, if you have a white collar job, why would I ever go into work? This is pretty cool and I could actually be more productive. Or a third hybrid model is, are you crazy? I got kids at home. They're screaming at me. I want them in school and I want to see human beings. I want to go to work for at least 2 days a week to at least socialize. So I think the best thing we know is that billions of people have now become accustomed to communicating this way. And that's not going to go to zero. And and for me, particularly the whole lean startup method, the one takeaway for me that's going to be permanent is if I know any students or investments I make that are physically calling on customers for a first sales meeting, I'm going to fire the CEO. That is the big lesson for me is customer discovery in a first meeting should be done via video conferencing. Why? Not because it's more effective. Of course not. You miss body language, you miss all those other cues, but you could do 3 to 5 times as more in one day than you could just driving down a block. So some of those changes will stick. I think, and that has a kind of interesting ripple effects. If I'm right there, for example, business travel will go down by 10%. And that 10% is probably the most profitable 10% or some number. So there might be some permanent changes on some segments of the market. But you can imagine boom times in others. My wife and I can't, wait to start traveling again internationally. So the only thing I could guarantee is whatever I said, bet on the opposite. So I've been wrong so far in this pandemic.
Perfect. Listen, Steve, I wanted to take an opportunity to thank you again for making time to join us on TrueNorthTV. It was great to see you. It was great to have a chance to chat about this stuff. And of course, it would be interesting to see, looking back in a year's time as to, where we were right and where we were wrong.
Same here. And I really appreciate the time.
Excellent. Listen, I wanted to take the opportunity to also thank all of our viewers at home who joined us for today, and to let you know that next week, Tuesday at noon, is our final episode of the season, and it will feature none other than Kumail Nanjiani, star of The Big Sick, Silicon Valley, and it's going to be friggin' awesome, I gotta guarantee you. Anyway, take good care, stay safe, be well.
Thanks for watching this episode of True North TV. To catch the next episode, subscribe to Communitech's channel.